I was like, okay, I think this is what I want to do. I felt like I didn't have anybody to make the path more safe for me, Jewishly, and I really wanted people to have an easier time claiming their identities and knowing that their spiritual and religious tradition could affirm who they are. I wanted to make sure that we weren't just about any specific identity, but really the love of humanity.
Hey dolls, welcome to The Gaily Dose, a family of queer people who have fun, elevated conversation to build a deeper sense of community in our LGBTQ world. Check us out at thegailydose.com or at The Gaily Dose Pod on all social media.
Girl, you better come get your Gaily Dose.
Welcome to The Gaily Dose. This is Helmut Lucero Domagalski. We're coming to you in this very special time of Pride as we celebrate something that's very special to us in the queer community. And for this particular episode, I'm so excited to have a dose of pride with faith with our very special guest, Rabbi Josh Lesser. Hey Josh, how are you?
Good.
We're so excited to have you.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, well, we are ecstatic to talk about how faith and pride are such a beautiful intersection, and you have been a true stalwart in this space, and we're excited to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, thank you.
We know it took some time, but we got your human heart on.
Hi, dolls. I'm here with our fabulous Rabbi Josh. What a sweet guy. And tonight, I'm going to be co-hosting the Human Heart On. I like to say it very carefully in case there's any mistake. I, for one, want to nominate for the Human Heart On the Sojourn organization. And the reason I want to nominate it is because in 2019, I photographed this fabulous event called Pour 'em Off Ponds. And Bex Taylor Klaus was the honoree. And since I had photographed her bat mitzvah and the whole vortex of that family, I volunteered as soon as I heard about it to go shoot it.
Yes.
And when I went there in my ubiquitous man garb photographer of black pants, black shirt, black shoes, I felt like a sucking hole of sadness. Because everywhere in that room, people were accepting and they were loving and there was no judgment of anyone. And I met my first trans person there.
Wow.
And I spoke to her, and she was so honest and so open. I told her, I think you're beautiful. And I meant it. And so I said to myself, I don't know if I'm ever going to do this again. But if I do, I'm going to do something different. I didn't know what that was. So just before the pandemic, I was asked to do it again. Kenny Blank was being honored for that night.
Sure.
And
I remember.
And I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go in femme. And I didn't know what all that meant, but I embraced it and loved it. And when I went to that event in femme, I was so loved and so affirmed, and it struck so many things with me. I mean, really and truly changed my life in unequivocal ways. So I want to thank and nominate, and of course, a big shout out to the Sojourn organization, because it really is a place of joy and acceptance and love. And you happened to help start that, didn't you?
You know, I was the founder. I Sojourn, which is the Southern Jewish Resource Network for Gender and Sexual Diversity, was originally called the Rainbow Center. And when I came to Atlanta, I received so many calls for help that I realized that I couldn't lead a congregation and serve all of the needs of our community alone. And it's very much like a national organization called Keshet, except we do things in a Southern way, which I think is that hospitality that you received, I think is a signature of what does it mean to be a Southern organization. And even more so, what feels really powerful is that what makes us distinct is that we don't serve the way just Jewish people. We use Jewish and universal values to serve LGBT people and their families. And so that's why there is so much acceptance. We want everyone to feel welcome and to have the possibility to have services if they need. We primarily are in the Jewish community, right? But we will serve and work with anyone.
Well, I can't say enough good things about them because it really started me on a journey where I now live my very best life so far. And I can point to that moment at that event that started. Anyway, hormones will do that to you kids. So you have someone you want to nominate for the Human Heart on. Who would that be?
Absolutely. I just feel like if I could nominate the entire trans community on some level, I would. Because I just feel like there is so much power and joy and love of our Atlanta trans community. But amongst the folks that I see time and time again at different rallies, who has been an activist from her very beginnings, is Tracy McDaniel, who is the executive director of Juxtaposed for Transformations. And it is a center that serves all of the needs of the trans community. And one of the things that I love most about Tracy is that she says that she isn't an activist or an advocate because she feels like she has to. It is because it's innate in how she walks through the world. And so I think she is such a great example for how we can live our truths and work and serve other people. So Tracy McDaniel is my nomination.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi, very, very much. It's been a joy having you on the Human Heart On.
Thank you.
Thank you for your nomination, and thank you for founding Soden.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Let's zoom into that doll and double click.
Today's double click is around a theme that we love to celebrate pridefully in the gay community, and that is unconditional love. When we throw that word out there, there are a lot of different interpretations to that phrase, but there's one that I want to remind you of that's very special and unique to the queer community. If you think about unconditional love, I think personally about the spectrum of my thoughts. I think about the fact that I've had some really virtuous, amazing thoughts in my life, but I've also had some pretty sinister and dark ones. As a father, I have to tell you, when I look at my children, I know that they are capable of that entire spectrum of thinking. And to me, unconditional love is the ability to embrace the fact that all of those thoughts are inside the pasture of the way we have been created. We are capable of exploring all kinds of thoughts in our brains. But when we love someone unconditionally, we love them with all of that universe of thoughts, knowing that they've all been a part of that person. And yet we don't judge them, but we love them because in the end, we know that that life is precious, even though it may have struggled with thoughts that aren't always that great. We struggle sometimes to give ourselves first that degree of unconditional love, to know that any thought and any place that you've explored is okay. We don't want to linger in every place, but to know, to love, and embrace the whole part of you, yourself, is an important part of unconditional love that you must practice for yourself. And a great place to practice that for yourself is to practice it with other people. Every human deserves to be loved. Every human deserves unconditional love. And we as queer people have a unique opportunity to love others in maybe ways and shapes and forms unconditionally that they may not have known before. So I encourage you, as we take up our queer mantle and as we pridefully walk forward in our various faiths and backgrounds, to remember that truly unconditional love is a beautiful thing that we should celebrate within our community and with the entirety of humanity.
A dose of pride in faith with Rabbi Josh Lesser.
All right, doll. So as I promised, we're going to get some time with Rabbi Josh here. And I'm going to ask, first of all, I'm going to say, for those of you who don't yet know this wonderful human, this man has been such an important part of our lives here in the Southeast, even though you may not know it. Forming our very first queer synagogue, and also the Sojourn organization, which is an organization committed to the intersection of Jew and queer, but also a leader in our community, and actually one of the very first groups that backed the Gaily Dose. I would love for you to talk a little bit, what is it that drove you to choose this course of queer and Jewish and leadership?
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. So, in many ways, I grew up here in Atlanta, so I consider myself a Southerner, though my parents are from Brooklyn.
Yes.
So I kind of feel like I'm a Southerner with Northern sensibilities. And in part because of some of the anti-Semitism that my family experienced, they took me out of public school very young and put me into traditional Jewish day school. So half the day was Judaic studies and half of the day was English. I loved the Jewish piece more than I did the traditional studies. I was this little kid. I loved to sing. I loved my prayers. And in many ways, that stayed with me. And like many teenagers, a lot of that drifted away. The piece that didn't was a commitment and connection that was drilled into me as a child of our responsibility to community. And so most of my teenage years here in Atlanta, I was working with Special Olympics and children with disabilities, helped start a camp for kids with disabilities. I would say that's where I truly discovered God, rather than kind of this like punishing God or this God that was judging us. I found that in the community of people with disabilities, this like acceptance of just being warmly embraced. And I think in many ways that helped me on my own coming out journey, because I too could see that no matter who I was, that there was a part that should be loved and embraced in that kind of way. But I was really acutely aware of the traditional messages that we grow up in when you go to a traditional religious education, pretty much regardless of most religions. And so I got very anti-gay messages. And so that created barriers in my own coming out and a lot of shame to overcome. So fast forward many years, when I am coming out, I'm still very connected to my Jewish life. I was the president of Hillel, which is the Jewish Student Union at Northwestern University. And there, I was out in my life in Chicago, and I was closeted on campus.
Okay.
I saw this book called Twice Blessed at the gay bookstore, and it was about the blessings of being Jewish and gay. And something clicked for me, and I realized that there were people who were trying to find a way that these two identities could exist. But I also recognized that I didn't have any role models, and that I still, as a Jewish leader, wanted to find some integration. I was going to apply to a law school. I did Teach for America because I thought I was going to locate myself working on public policy issues, particularly in the inner city. And so I had worked in an all-black school in New Orleans. I was the first core for Teach for America to be in New Orleans, where I learned so much about race in America that had been hidden from me. But I realized that I was falling into a trap of white saviorism and white hopeness. And that if I wanted to serve community, I needed to go back to my community, to the Jewish community, and then build bridges outwardly. And so as I began to have that awareness, I came home to Atlanta, and I attended services at the congregation that I have led for 22 years, that I recently now am emeritus. And someone I'd gone to Orthodox day school with was leading services, and she announced she had just gotten into rabbinical school to become a rabbi. And all of my wheels started turning.
You're like,
yes. And I was like, okay, I think this is what I want to do. And in part, some of it was I wanted to be a role model. I think there still is that a little bit of arrogance there but I felt like I didn't have anybody to make the path more safe for me Jewishly. And I really wanted people to have an easier time claiming their identities and knowing that their spiritual and religious tradition could affirm who they are. And so that really set me ablaze that way. And it also, I wanted to make sure that we weren't just about any specific identity, but really the love of humanity.
Yeah, that is a very high calling. Because when I think about that, now wasn't raised in the Jewish tradition, I was raised in the Christian tradition.
Sure.
But the amount that you're called in to have the dialogues, the hard conversations that others may not be willing to have,
yes.
right? And really shine out as a leader is a path that is very, one travels that alone. But it's really, I'm just giving you kudos in that I know that is a life that is a lot of sacrifice in it for something that's quite beautiful. And to hear that you were called to do that and you follow that calling is beautiful.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I do too. I think a lot of people do. And a lot of people have been blessed by that journey and that choice, which is already a testament, no matter if you do anything after this podcast or not, and you will do more, I know. So talk a little bit about, you have this Atlanta congregation, and you start to sculpt some initial goals, right, with this queerness, and tell me how that happens.
Sure.
And what are you most proud of from what that congregation has become?
Absolutely. So I was hired as the first full-time rabbi at Congregation Beit Chaverim. It was founded in 1985, largely by a group of gay men, some lesbians. They were originally a social group that realized, hey, we don't need more friends. What we need is a religious and spiritual home where we can be our true, authentic selves. I was a teenager at this point, a young teenager actually.
Okay.
And I remember even going to the synagogue when I was like 17 with my best friend, who grew up here and has a similar story to me. We walked in and we're like, oh my God, everyone is so old. They were probably they were in their 30s, and like it was for a Hanukkah party, and then we skedaddled out of there. So to come back and become the rabbi in my late 20s, to my hometown, I felt like I had something to prove. You know, at that time, I kind of felt like I had a big chip on my shoulder. It's kind of worn down to a little pebble, but in some ways, it's still there. And the congregation basically said, Josh, we want you to put us on the map. And so for me, as someone who is very community focused, I wanted to make sure that people not only knew that Congregation Beit Chaverim existed, but that we were an important and essential aspect to the ecosystem of Jewish Atlanta. And I wanted the LGBTQ community to understand that Jews were part of the Southern experience and that we had something to offer as well. In some ways, that was my initial goal. And I was able to do that well, I think in part because I was a really non-threatening person. That wherever I would go in Jewish Atlanta, people would say, oh, I drove his carpool. You know, and they remembered me as a child. And I think that it helped humanize me. And because I was a kind kid, I think that people realized that I was actually approachable, and that I would always say that I'm a product of this Jewish Atlanta community. And so everybody should feel that they have contributed to me becoming a rabbi. And so I try to weave my narrative with our community's narrative. And I think there is a lot of acceptance. And where people didn't accept me, I was persistent but kind. And so even when I was doing it a little bit mischievously, because there were a number of people in the Jewish community who wouldn't even acknowledge my presence, and even a little darker edge to it is I got death threats, but I never let people see that affect me publicly. And so I would show up everywhere with a smile, greeting people and saying kind of nicely, I'm here, you're not going to get rid of me. And in fact, I grew up here, so this is my community. When I think about goals, the thing in some ways you asked what I'm most proud of is after a few years, I knew that if we were just to serve the LGBT community, that wasn't the right space for me to lead. I think because when we look at so many challenges, that there's so many gifts that the LGBT community can offer to the larger world. And I would say we know spiritually about authenticity. We know spiritually about radical welcoming and embrace. And so I said to the board, if you just want to serve LGBT Jews and their loved ones, that is a fine choice. But ultimately, I probably am not the right rabbi. But if we want to take the founding values and apply them to so many more people, to say that these are our queer founding values of hospitality, of welcoming, of authenticity, and have that be the cornerstone of who we are, being values driven, then this is the right community. And I predicted, and I didn't know how, like, this is one of the predictions that have come true. And I said, if we start welcoming more and more straight folks, we will have more children in this community. And having more children in this community means that when children grow up, they will either be strong allies, which we need, or when they come out as queer, trans, non-binary, gay, lesbian, bi, or pan, they will know that their Jewish community, their spiritual home, has loved them from the very start. And they wouldn't have the conflicts that I had in the community that gave me mixed messages. And I said, for me, that is worth giving up comfort for. The comfort of just being with like-minded folks. If we can do that, there's this concept in Jewish spirituality called Tikkun Olam, which means world repair. I was like, that is truly healing and repairing the world if we can create a home for our youth. In 2022, we've had so many queer kids. We've had so many amazing allies. And so that, like, how can you not be proud of a place where children are celebrated for who they are?
For sure. And I think there's that aspect. So first of all, a couple things.
Sure.
Number one, I love that you spoke to very specifically this. You kind of talked about this. There's some clear strategy you had to play, right? To be an agent of change in a community, you have to recognize that there are agents that are not for you yet. Right?
Yes.
And you have to have the long suffering and the patience to meet them and constantly meet them with love. And that is, it's a little detail in there, but I think, dolls, as you think about your own lives, your own families, your own paths, that is a very real and honorable thing to do. It's not strategy for the purpose of, corruption. It's strategy for good and for love, and it's hearts and minds, right?
Yes. And I think that, what I want to say, to your community is that when we get rejected, it hurts. And so we often want to strike back, and totally understandable. But if we know truly who we are, and we know that core, if we can rise above that, I have seen time and time again the transformation of hearts and minds, and that's what's going to transform this country.
Yeah, I agree. And the second part of what you said that I think is, I kind of transfer myself into a parent, right? So as a parent, I want to raise my children in certain traditions.
Yes.
That could be Christian or Jewish or Islam, whatever that is. But having that safe space for that straight child or a queer child, right? Yep. To basically be able to know that they can be authentic, they're welcomed, and we embrace reality here. Right? We embrace the reality of the fact that women and men are equal. We embrace the reality that all races are equal. We embrace the reality that queer is naturally God-made.
Yes.
Right? That is an environment that a child can thrive in. And I applaud you for creating that. And I think for any of you dolls out there who don't believe that you can maybe go back to your faiths or explore them, if you can go back to a place like this and engage, you may be able to reconnect to something that was precious before.
What I love what you just said about reality is that we all know too many faith communities where there is a narrow standard of how people have to show up. And so a false reality gets put out to the world so that people, if going through divorce or if somebody's struggling with mental illness, like all of those things have to be hidden in so many faith communities. But when you have a community that is built on authenticity, and that's why this queer value, where I think we know that in our core, can help so many people. There's a prayer at the synagogue called the Prayer for the End of Hiding. And 22 years, I have heard straight people talk about, while the prayer says, as gay and lesbian Jews, or now actually one of our teens rewrote it, so it is as LGBTQ Jews. Straight people say that alongside us, which is just amazing, because it means that they're allies and they're willing to step in our shoes. But they've talked about how this message that invites people to end hiding and to claim their fullness is a message that has impacted their lives as straight folks. And so it just teaches me again and again that we have spiritual messages that are gifts to the world, but that we can learn from each other and be better because of it.
For sure. Because if you think about it, we kind of are given this, like, we break all traditions in a way, but then also validate others. So Rabbi Josh, I think one of the things that's so interesting about your work is that it has been at a time in which we truly are digitally connected. And so I'm curious how that connectivity has transformed or affected your work and the reach of it.
Sure. And, in thinking about the pandemic, where basically the entire faith community needed to be better in terms of reaching into people's homes, I actually had a front seat for this rapid change that we've experienced over the past 2 years. Maybe it's because there's a number of members of our congregation that are part of the CDC, but I think maybe I had a half a second awareness that what was happening back in March of 2020 was going to be big. I created a Facebook group called Spiritual and Faith Communal Responses to COVID-19, thinking that maybe I would get 100 of my closest friends and of all different faiths to help each other navigate this necessary digital time. And quickly, 1,000 people joined, 2,000 people joined. I think even today, there's close to 9,000 people in this group.
Oh, that's great.
All around the world. And during the pandemic, we turned to one another to offer support very practically. So out of this, there were pages that came Zoom Faith, where we were learning about what are the best cameras, what are the best microphones. There were all of these things that were coming at clergy and community leaders like this, and I had no idea of the impact. And at the same time, we were also dealing with the emotional effects of what was happening to our communities, the loss of being together in person, thinking about how can you reach through the screen and develop a relationship with an audience without seeing them. And it took a toll. And part of the role that I played was showing this community a sense of spiritual care and compassion. And I think receiving that themselves helped them understand that you can form a strong bond, as I'm sure you have with your audience, even when they're not physically in the room, because we had no other choice. And there was a strand of queer folks that, I think understood that this was an opportunity to reach into rural places where often there are no welcoming communities, or communities don't feel safe. And so in our synagogue, there were people coming from all over Georgia. But there was also a way where using a social media strategy for our first High Holy Days, we ended up having maybe 10,000 people attend our Rosh Hashanah services. And we're a much smaller synagogue than many of these larger synagogues. And so with a person who was leading that strategy, he helped us go global.
Great.
And so we had people from South America seeing and hearing both a contemporary, meaningful, purpose-driven message that was also inclusive, particularly of LGBT and gender equality. And people were writing us that we don't have this here.
Yeah.
And so there's a tremendous opportunity using our full technological platforms to reach into places, to let people know that there are affirming, loving, spiritual communities that will welcome them. And I think we have just scratched the surface, and that there is so much more. From the interfaith group I created, there was also a Jewish group. And for me, I wanted it to be positive, so I called it Dreaming Up.
Yeah.
And I wanted us to be able to dream how to do this. And so now we're in a place where we want to do multi-access, because what I'm interested in is helping communities think about how you can bridge the people in the room with the people who are joining from their homes, rather than the flat experience that so many people have as passive observers. And what we've known is that there are some people who want to be in the room and want to be social, and there are some people who want to be in their pajamas, having their glass of wine at any time of the day, or even, watching at a more convenient hour. But when we have people live from their homes, there still is a way where using technology we can bridge that relationship. And we, I think, are just on the cutting edge. And in some ways, as I told you, I was the senior rabbi. I transitioned last May, in part because I wanted to work on projects that had a greater impact than just one community. And that's really where I am right now.
Yeah, I will tell you, so there's so many questions I get from that, only because it's interesting that the evangelical movement in Christianity had a lot of sort of like this church, but here are all the vassal churches, and then here are all the, so they already had some of that, like, let me just project so-and-so out to all these places, right? And then you get your small groups where you get some of that, but then you transfer that into then where you have the screen, and let's be real, you have an opportunity, if you're a seeking person, to find the right message, right? In the cacophony of people who think they've found the right thing, you can kind of weigh in your heart where you're getting the right message and find an embracing spiritual path.
You know, and I think that what is so unpleasant to so many folks is that, particularly here in the South, that we have grown up with televangelists that, either have swindled people or have given really strong anti-inclusion messages that have been more harm than good. And so, there was this joke that we've all become televangelists in some ways because of the pandemic. But I believe that we have the opportunity, that technology is a tool and that we can redeem the tool, and it doesn't have to be flat. One of the things that I don't want is people to think that I have every answer. I want people to be able to think for themselves and to have a sense of inspiration. That has not been what has been televised for all of these years. Yeah. These are people with canned answers for problems. I want to connect with the deep thinkers. I want to connect with people who both have a sense of wonder in the world, but also maybe a sense of doubt. Bring all of your questions.
You know what is so beautiful about that? So think about that. Religious and control. Like, how long is the story of don't think for yourselves, listen to this? But how beautiful is it that queer people in faiths would be the ones that would say, wait a second, right? The embracing of the unknown, the embracing of the doubt, right? The embracing of the curiosity is going to lead you to a higher understanding of this faith. Right? Yes. And yourself. And that's a really cool intersection of queer and faith.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the gifts that Judaism brings to the faith conversation is that we are a community that invites questions. Even in my traditional upbringing, part of what I think was my saving grace was I could challenge the rabbis, I could ask questions, I could bring doubts, and to have that work with my queer identity, and to question even the messages that were taught to me by my rabbis, had me, which is what I think queer folk need in this moment, is to be aware that there is a divine spark in each and every one of us. And that if we can attune ourselves, as even the Hebrew Bible or the scriptures say, that there's a still small voice. So that's about discernment. Like, we can mislead ourselves. I've misled myself. But when we really train to hear the godly voice within us, it can help us transcend that fear. It's what sparks our authenticity, our giftedness. It has us want to connect and offer service. And so that, I want to help people connect to that in these times.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, only because I also, this would make no sense, I relate to that as someone who was raised in Christian faith. Because obviously we share some books, yes. And those promises where God says, I knew you in the womb, I have chosen you, you are a chosen people. There are so many messages that were so clearly true as a young person. Even as I adopted queerness and embraced it, these certain truths didn't leave.
Sure. They
were still there, etched as truths for me.
Yes.
And once you kind of realize that knowing and some of those messages that are written on your heart that's New Testament, right? Maybe it's written in the Old too.
It's in the Midrash.
Okay. But that actually is this beautiful, again, intersection of queer and faith. I also want to just take a moment to say that I think that the fact that you're able to send those messages globally is a huge issue in good. Good. Because there are a lot of, we forget how many of us dolls are in other countries that do not have the enlightenment that we have been afforded. And so your words are probably affecting a lot of people out there. Let's talk a little bit about our own community, if we can, for a second. So in queer, I always say every nation's been blessed with queer, which means we have not only within ourselves all of our types, right? We have body types. We've got, the letters, and that divides us all. We've got race. We've got gender. We've got religion. Like, you've got all of us together. You got every variety of society.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious as to how, for us to, when we think of switching from the Jewish community to the queer community, right? How do we start practically to knit those things? What can we do? What can our dolls do to move that needle forward in terms of embracing each other across race and religion, et cetera?
Right. No, it's such an important question because I think that, not only has every nation, as you've said so beautifully, been gifted by queerness, it's that also the queer community embraces all of these differences as well. Like that we are a blessed community because we have this richness. And so it really means that I think it's incumbent upon us to do better and to educate ourselves around the ways that we've grown up in a racist, ableist, sexist society, and that many of us grew up with these messages, just like we grew up with homophobic messages that need to be unpacked. And so I often feel that because so much of our community gets brought together because of love, not every community necessarily identifies that way, and that so many of us don't necessarily have our parents as models. We're not necessarily in the same community as our parents when we look at that kind of label around queerness. Every now and then, someone is blessed with a queer parent, and hallelujah when that happens. But often, so it creates that divide. So in many ways, we need to be family to each other. And we need to recognize that to do well by one another, we have to be able to stand up and advocate for one another's rights. One of the things that I say when I work on racial justice is that without saying a word, I am working on homophobia and I am working on anti-Semitism because I show up fully. Like, people know who I am as a queer Jew when I'm in that space, but I don't have to keep pushing my issue. I'm there as an ally. But what I will tell you is that my presence and standing alongside people changes hearts and minds. For me, when I look at our community, I want to start by advocating for those who are most vulnerable. Because if we start there, that makes our community safer and more vibrant for everyone. It's one of the reasons why, for me, trans women of color or queer people with disabilities or at-risk youth, these are some of our most vulnerable communities. And if we go back to our faith traditions, that is who we are called to protect and care for and empower first. I don't want to do anything that actually is patronizing. I really want to understand and uplift and stand aside those voices because I see the interconnectivity that our lives will depend upon this, and that when we divide by our letter or by our animal, we end up really diminishing and hurting ourselves. We don't recognize that. When we're able to advocate and mobilize together and push the agenda, and even if the agenda moves in one direction, we shouldn't be so fearful that somehow we're being left out. And I'm talking about particularly those of us who are in more mainstream. As a white cisgender male, there's a lot of privilege that I'm afforded, and I want to use that privilege to support the fullness of our community.
Yeah, I think that's very wise of you. It's something that also, honestly, it's a shared value, that concept that like the privilege that we have as gay and light-skinned and educated, right, is for a purpose, right? Part of that is then the taking care of the parts of our queer community that struggle most. You said a couple things that were really interesting and that I'd want to highlight for our dolls. One thing is you said love, right? Yep. And I do think it's like this journey, the journey of self-love for us in the queer community is one that is bumpy. And we're all still working on it, right?
Absolutely.
I think that unconditional love, to truly be able to see another person and love them, it is still, we have all these biases in ourselves that sometimes don't allow that. I would encourage all of us as queer people, if you kind of make that understanding, let's say there's 20% of the population, if you're in it's the right generation, our generation might be more 7%. We have an opportunity to get to know every kind of human.
Yes.
You can get to know a Black lesbian. You can get to know a Hispanic trans person. We have it all.
Sure.
It's all there.
Yes.
We get to practice love at a level that others, we're drawn out from amongst the people into these city centers and or online connected to, and we get to do that.
Absolutely.
That's pretty cool.
But if we get real and a little real talk, which is that particularly, so our community has an intersection of both sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah.
And while there are strong corollaries, those are different aspects of our identity.
Agreed.
But let's talk about the sexual orientation piece. Because sex and sexuality is in this mix, it confuses lots of things.
Yes, it does.
And so sometimes we identify our community simply as those that we want to have sex with.
Right.
And that's where we get our animals, particularly in the gay male community.
Yep.
I don't want to be so gay male focused, but when sex is the only thing, and it's an important thing, I'm a sex positive rabbi.
Right.
And so that said, I want us to recognize that when it comes to our rights and how we want to live in community, we have to transcend that it's just about sex. And that somewhat this primal urge doesn't always get in the way of what is our common good. They're both important, but too often we limit our community and value only those we want to have sex with. And that creates a complication, and we miss out. We were talking earlier about friends and so for me, the diversity of my friendships is beloved to me, and I feel like I am so much a better person. Mm-hmm. And that, yes, I'm a gay man who likes to have sex with men. And so, that's an important aspect, but that doesn't drive who I am in every aspect of my life.
Yeah, and I think that's really important for our dolls to hear who are in the gay male community. Though in speaking with lesbians and others, they're just as polarized sometimes around sex being the driving piece. I do think though in the gay community, we see it being such an overriding part of the masculine male, experience, that it does override a lot of the other avenues that we have to contribute.
And people get marginalized in that as well.
They do.
And so,
they do.
I sometimes fear that I've been a strong, fierce advocate for trans rights, and too often cisgender gay men can be some of the most harmful towards our trans family. And it ends up hurting us when we do that. We need to stand together because there are enough other people who are coming for us.
Yeah, and it's so interesting you say that because there's the defensive piece. I always encourage gay men, get to know your trans family. You just get to know one of them well, and your whole attitude will change if you're willing. I'm curious about the religion piece, so just explore that a little bit more. Yep. So you get a queer Jew, a queer Christian, a queer enter other faiths. How do we start to tear down those walls and move towards source of common sense of ethics or morals or whatever word you want to use? What are the things that we can do in those regards?
When I was a student at Northwestern and became the president of Hillel, in Chicago, right up the street from Northwestern, is the Baha'i Temple of North America. This beautiful building that has these amazing, it's like one of the most magnificent structures in our country, and most people don't know about it. And there are these amazing rose gardens, and it was where I would go wander for my own kind of centering. Mm-hmm. And I went into the gift store of the Baha'i Temple, and there was this poster that had these little children from every different faith and ethnicity represented, and it shared the golden rule in every single faith. So in the Jewish tradition, the golden rule is do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. And the Christian faith flips that, and it is do unto others as you would want someone to do unto you. And for me, there are an abundance of common good truths that lead us to be in relationship with one another. Our rituals, our practices, our stories are really important to our identities, but ultimately we can stand. We don't, one of the things that I think the queer community can help people do is not buy into the binaries, that it's you're either Jewish or you're universal. I actually identify as a universalist who inherited the Jewish story, and that the Jewish story is so meaningful and powerful. It drives me, but at the end of the day, I want to share a universal connection with humanity.
Yes.
But I am Jewish and I'm proud. I bring all my stories, I bring all my rituals, and I do that. I'm a rabbi who doesn't just serve Jews. I'm a rabbi who serves humanity with my Jewish ritual knowledge and ability. And I think that we can begin to make that shift. There's a tribalism that can happen in religion, and what we just talked about with our LGBTQ community is also a form of breaking down in these small tribes. We need to transcend, we can spend time with our tribe, but we need to transcend that. When we think about things like global warming and climate crisis, we have things that we need to face as a united world. And we need leaders who are deeply rooted in their traditions, but also know that the traditions point to one common source and one common idea of embracing humanity.
Yeah, I almost wonder sometimes what those tenets are. You spoke to the golden rule, which effectively, inherently has in that those concepts of love of self
and love
of others.
Yes.
Right? And then you have, as you call it, the universalism, right? Which I have recently been calling my love of the gods, because each of the gods take you to the same place, right? That we are all together, we are all one. All right, Rabbi Josh. So as we progress our conversation around pride and faith, I'm curious, if you were looking here at our dolls, our queer community, and you were to give them a sermon to inspire them in this time and in this place in history, what would you say over our dolls?
Well, first I would make it short because they already know that a rabbi can talk. Honestly, to me, the evergreen message that love wins is so essential. And that in a time where Roe v. Wade is being challenged, which we understand is a gateway to potentially bigger challenges, we have to double down on understanding that this sense of love will triumph. It is what always triumphs. And I think in addition to that, not only does love win, but that when we allow ourselves that sense of love and to be loving, it unleashes our gifts. And as you've heard me say throughout today, each and every one of us, each and every one of your dolls has a gift to bring to bear to the world. And when we understand our purpose and find the intersection of how our purpose can benefit others, it lights us up. And I think that there is something so special about who we are as an LGBTQ community that the world needs our gifts. And so don't let anything hold that back. You are meant to be and do what you were created to. That would be my sermon.
That's a beautiful sermon. I don't know about you, dolls, but love is complex and beautiful and hard, but it is worthy. It is worthy, and it is something we are. I think you're absolutely right. We are uniquely positioned to share in a way that the rest of society doesn't even understand yet. As we look at pride and we think about Pride Future,
yes,
what are some of your visions or thoughts around pride and its future?
I have really believed that pride is one of many values that we need to embrace as a community. And so I would love for us as Pride Future to begin to flesh out what are those values. And so we've been talking about this idea of inclusivity, having that be an aspect of our pride. We are talking about a sense of trust and being trustworthy with one another. So, I see this vision of pride really deepening how we live a committed sense of what our values are in the world. And I also see that who we are becoming is even more diversified. With a greater sense of gender identity also comes a greater sense of the possibility of relationships and being in loving relationships with one another, that I think that our pride begins to kind of expand in terms of who we are and what we connect to.
First of all, that's awesome. I love that vision, because what it does is it takes pride and moves it from just like, hey, we're queer, to we're queer, but we stand for these values. I was sitting here looking at the flag and just thinking, like, what are the values? You also mentioned authenticity, which I thought earlier was, so authenticity, inclusivity. We have an opportunity to define, without apology, because when you know your purpose, you are able to not apologize, because you know that your purpose is good.
Yes.
And I think that is taking pride to a higher level in terms of thinking about the values that we have and what should they be, and we get to pick that out.
Yes. Well, and speaking of those values, you were talking to me earlier about valuing history, and so I was just wondering if you wanted to say a little bit about what it means to show up pride valuing history.
Well, I think two things I was thinking of. So one is, look, pride was a march at first, and then it's the celebration. And I think that we want to just stick in the celebration mode and go to the parties and celebrate. And we have to recognize that that celebration took cost, and the cost doesn't stop being asked of us, right? So it scares me a little bit. We think about pride where everyone's sort of dissipating into the archipelagos of gay in the cities, and you can be gay anywhere. And we're forgetting that there was a march and a lot of cost to get here, and that will continue to be asked of us at Pride. Pride should also be, what are you doing to move us forward? What are you doing to make sure that this banner still waves where it doesn't wave in many countries across this earth?
Sure.
It's a global march, and I think we're also feeling that, right? We're seeing certain things, gay marriage, maybe, we may be doing this in June, and hey, we'll see that doesn't mean the march is over. That means the march must continue. We must progress.
Yes.
There's
there's a quote from a Jewish revolutionary that basically says, it's not my revolution unless there's dancing, is paraphrasing that.
Very nice.
And one of the things that I had T-shirts made for our congregation that says joy is an act of resistance. And so I think alongside the march has to be the celebration. That what you're talking about is these two have to go together, and that our joy has to be intentional. And that sometimes the celebration can feel separate from all of the things that had us arrive at this moment. One of the things that I think that we're great at as queer folks is develop a sense of wonder. And we're also really great at being jaded and skeptical. And I think that if we can lean into that sense of wonder, we can appreciate our history and we can claim our joy.
Yeah, and the other aspect that I know we chatted a little bit about earlier was the fact that from a historic perspective, this is an unprecedented time.
Yes.
The fact that we're having this dialogue about what our pride can look like and what our faith can look like, we're more out than we've ever been, and that scares a lot of people.
Yes.
Right?
And we have the technology to bring it into countries and places that have not experienced this. This is why when I say love wins, we are an unstoppable force.
Yeah.
We are the Davids to the Goliath. Yeah. And, David, who is a queer character in the Hebrew Bible. So,
True, which is actually a good point. If you think about it, though, I think about the story that you started this whole thing with where you're a young boy who loved the prayers and loved that. And there's that sweetness inside of so many queer people when I go back with them, as we have on the show, and explore their past, that you realize that sweetness is something that is very beautiful, very precious. And if we're able to take that and transform that into the values that we're asking as adults of our common fellow man, I think it is possible to be truly a globe of love.
What you just said just sparked this like really powerful thought for me, which is that, when I came here to Atlanta and I knew that I was going to have to face, as I described earlier, the kinds of hatred and that so many people had, I had to build up a shield. I felt very defended. My journey into my own connectedness has been to take that armor off and be my more tender, vulnerable self, because that is where true, authentic connection, and that, I think, is all of our journey. And it connects me to that boy that had so much joy just in singing and feeling connected to creation.
Yeah, that's beautiful, because I think it's a return to childhood in some ways, and a return to that beautiful, unadulterated, unconditional love. Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to ask you, would you possibly give us a blessing before you go?
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you a blessing that is one of the most ancient blessings from our tradition. I'll say it in Hebrew, and then I'll translate it as we go along. Okay. So, Yivarecha Adonai ve'yishmerecha kein yehi ratzon. May God bless you and protect you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'kuneka kein yehi ratzon. May the divine shine light upon you and show you grace. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasim lecha shalom kein yehi ratzon. May the divine lift their face towards you and show you peace. Kein yehi ratzon. So for all of you dolls, may you know the beauty of your own truth. May you dance with your own spirit. May nothing deter you from finding your path in this world, knowing your place, understanding your name, living your love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dolls everywhere unite. It's the call to Kiki.
Hey dolls, it's time for the call to Kiki. This section is always brought to you by Atlanta Black Pride, uniquely encouraging the intersection of both Black and gay. You can learn more about them at atlantablackpride.org. So as the call to Kiki always is, we are calling you to get on the phone, get in person with your other dolls, and talk about things and connect about things that this episode and any episode brought to you. And for Pride in Faith, I want to get you dolls to get together with your girls, your gals, and talk about your faith center and how your pride, your queerness, and your faith overlap. And it's an important, very personal conversation to have. But I think by being vulnerable with each other about something so close, you may find that you may level your pride up. Any additions to that?
Yeah, part of what I want to encourage people is to really think outside the box when you have these conversations. Don't feel like you have to practice your traditions, your beliefs in a building. You don't have to go to church, synagogue, or a masjid. Go outside, connect with nature. There's so many ways that our spirituality can inspire our pride and connection to each other. And so don't necessarily let the traditional modes kind of feel like that's the way it has to be. Claim what makes sense to you, but be authentic doing it.
Thank you. Very good advice for you dolls. Think about those things, do them. Don't just intend to do them. Make sure you have those conversations. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. This was
my pleasure.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And I want to encourage you dolls, you want to check out, what is it, Weddings by Josh?
Yeah, if you're going to get married, I'd love to marry you.
Yes, or if you're going to have a bar mitzvah, bar mitzvah, what is it?
Bat mitzvah?
Yeah, bat mitzvah, yes.
Weddings are really my favorite thing in this moment, and so I might be able to talk into doing some other life cycles, but...
Yeah, well, especially for trans kids, that's a very, very special and unique thing that you can call him to do as well. Thank you so much. And we are going to wrap this up as we always do, dolls. I'm going to remind you to love yourself, love others, and don't forget to smile. Cheers.